This is Gregory Rasputin, spiritual advisor to Tsar Nicholas and Empress Alexandra. I was having a night on the town when Gella's henchmen from royal court put a couple of bullets in my back. Fortunately, Professor Buzzkill was there to minister to me and heal my wounds. Professor Buzzkill pays no heed to my teachings, but I am stoked beyond measure that his new episode is here. Slip on a bulletproof vest and listen with me.
Yes, indeed, it's Professor Buzzkill here, gluten-free, unintentionally non-profit, here in the Buzzkill bunker with one of your favorite professors. You keep emailing me, texting me, tweeting me, asking me to bring him back on, Professor Phil Nash. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing all right. Nobody can get enough, I guess.
Nobody can get enough. We wanted to call these Nash casts from the beginning, but our corporate overlords
But I was charging too much.
Yeah, that's right. Today we want to talk about a myth that's been plaguing American consciousness for the last, 30 years, 20 years. It's certainly a myth that when you're teaching, you hear a lot about, or you hear a lot of it. And often in the early 21st century, we heard a lot about freedom fries and things like that. A lot of anti-French mythology. Well, not anti-French, anti-French sentiments.
We love to hate us some French.
Yeah, the idea that the U.S. bails the French out of all these kind of wars. And even, Professor, it goes on to include a Miller High Life beer commercial.
Exactly. I can even bring in Miller High Life. Some folks may remember this. I did. It's still out there. It's from 2003.
We found it on the YouTubes. And here's the audio.
It's hard to respect the French when you have to bail them out of two big ones in 1 century. But we have to hand it to them on mayonnaise. Nice job, Pierre.
Okay, what's he doing there? We give him the audio, but we didn't give him the video, Professor. What is he doing there?
There's just a pair of hands scraping the last bit of mayonnaise out of a mayonnaise jar. And that's, in other words, we've done all this stuff for the French, but we're thanking them in return for the invention of mayonnaise.
And nice job, Pierre. Sounds so offensive. It's just amazing.
A little condescending.
Amazing that the French embassy didn't, register a complaint.
Officially protest.
Basically, this myth's, the way I think of it, it starts during the Iraq War in 2003,
right?
Where the French government decides not to become an ally in the invasion of Iraq.
Right. I'm pretty sure it predates that. That's certainly that sort of rekindled it, certainly, because they did not cooperate with the Iraq War, and a lot of Americans took that personally. But I had heard it earlier, or versions of it earlier, and I think, to my mind, it's part of a larger myth or a larger misconception, and I will call it the Uncle Sucker myth.
Uncle Sucker.
The Uncle Sucker myth, yes, and you see this, you see this in many, many different ways, and this is just sort of one version of it, so it's like a subset.
Yeah.
But to my mind, what it basically suggests is that our role in the world is that of the sucker. In other words, we easily get played. We're too generous. We do things for other people. It doesn't benefit us. We spend our tax dollars frivolously on tons of foreign aid, and my favorite factoid is that if you ask Americans, this was recently done, ask Americans what percentage of the federal budget goes to foreign aid, they typically guess around 27%. In other words, more than a quarter of the budget.
Yeah, and what is it?
It's actually less than 1%.
Less than 1%?
Yeah, it's less than 1%. And so now we can argue about, is foreign aid spent properly? Do we get our return on investment, et cetera, et cetera? There's a good debate to be had about that. But the idea that we just
public affairs debate,
exactly. But the idea that we just sort of give it away and get nothing in return is laughable and doesn't give our government nearly enough credit. We typically attach strings.
Are some Americans blamed as suckers, as part of the Uncle Sucker problem?
Just the government.
Yeah.
And, and this also bleeds into contempt for government and the idea that government can't do anything right and they just exist to waste your money.
I mean, is Wilson tarred as a Francophile, or anybody else tarred as a Francophile? World War I, World War II?
Question. No, I don't think so. No, not particular leaders, but it gets tied together with certain things in the past. For example, we always had a very fraught relationship with Charles de Gaulle,
right,
during and after World War II. The leader of the Free French during World War II, and then leader of France in the late 50s through the 60s. And he didn't like us very much, and a lot of that was reciprocated. And I think culturally, this is just me sort of riffing, but culturally, I think there's a sense that the French hate us.
Oh.
And American tourists always have stories about how they're mistreated by the French.
Snobby.
Yeah, exactly. Look down their noses at us, and so then there's this almost sort of a working class return contempt. Directed against the French.
You may think you have better food than we do, but we have better Miller High Life beer.
Right. Well, yeah. And by the way, we bailed you out of 2 world wars, and this is the thanks we get. I mean, I think there's culturally, sort of in terms of pop culture, I think there's something of that.
So let's talk about the 2 world wars. Those are the main ones that people focus on. So did we bail them out?
Well, and like a lot of myths and misconceptions, it's not baseless. And, at some level, the United States obviously plays an important role in ending World War I, certainly when it ended. We obviously, this is like capital O, obviously, played a key role in winning World War II and in liberating France, which had been occupied by the Germans for 4 years. I mean, I'm not at all downplaying our role in the World Wars.
Right. Okay.
I'm complicating the picture. Was what I'm doing here.
One of the things we love to do here at the Institute.
Complicating the picture, yeah. And also, at the same time, trying to suggest that this is not Uncle Sucker riding to the rescue.
Oh, okay. They were not provincial fools that Europeans take advantage of us every time.
Exactly, getting played again. And there was a sense, early in our history when one of the reasons we want to stay out of European affairs is as a fear that we would get played. These were these older, wilier powers always out to succor us, and so we should just not do that. But if you look at World War I, for example, and I'm just going to go through sort of a list of things I've come up with here to contextualize and complicate this picture of us bailing them out. First of all, the British and the French were not clearly losing World War I in the spring and summer of 1918 when our military forces first started appearing in France in large numbers.
Oh, okay. Because I think lots of people, lots of good-hearted people who believe this myth think that that's what we broke the stalemate, or we set the tide going back the other way.
Right. And, that's... And I'm taking a middle position here. That's not entirely false. And keep in mind just the context. We entered the war in April 1917, but it takes us a year to gear up. Our army was a joke in 1917, and we had to draft and train and ship over literally millions of troops. And they start appearing at a good time, which is the summer of 1918.
Right.
They start appearing in large numbers. The German offensive starts in late March 1918 and carries through the summer of 1918. It's a series of offensives. I think it's 5 separate offensives. They gained serious ground on the Western Front, but clearly that it was a last gasp attempt to win the war, and that clearly had failed, at which point the Americans start to show up in large numbers.
Okay.
Now, American troops do play a key role in stopping certain of these offensives at certain battles, like Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, where the Marines distinguished themselves. We also played a big role in reversing the German offensive and pushing them back in the fall of 1918, like the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where we play a big role, and that helps the Germans see the writing on the wall, basically.
Yeah.
So once again, I'm not saying we have no role at all.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is you really can't say we sort of saved the British and the French from a defeat they were going to suffer otherwise.
Okay, so the idea is that Germany was probably losing the war anyway, or at the very least was on the way to losing the war in 1918, and the United States added.
Yeah, we hastened the process.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
The Germans might have lasted a lot longer, but for example, they were suffering by 1918 mightily under the weight of the British naval blockade.
Right.
They were suffering extreme shortages at home. The idea that even without the Americans in the war, they could have won is, I would say, dubious at best.
The blockade is very, very serious, and it's certainly hurting the German home front in terms of war production and even food and things like that.
Nourishment, yep.
But what about the military aspect?
Right. That's important, too, because in that spring and summer offensive, the Germans, like I said, made serious gains, especially compared to the usual trench deadlock. They created a couple of serious bulges in the front, but they had suffered enormous casualties among some of their best troops.
Oh.
And after the offensive, they were at a point where they couldn't replace those losses, even compared to the British and the French. And this is leaving aside the involvement of the Americans.
Okay.
Now, once again, the Americans are by this point are arriving at a rate of, I think, 10,000 a month. And... or is it 10,000 a week? I forgot. It's a lot, and it's very demoralizing for the Germans because they notice that there are these increasingly large numbers of fresh troops appearing on the other side, and then the Germans can't match that.
Right.
So that's important. But even without the Americans, the Germans were by July 1918 running into an enormous manpower problem.
Okay, so we don't like to predict on this show. We don't like to speculate too much. But it could be that the Germans would have lost the war through a grinding down process by the end of 1918, somewhere middle of 1919.
Right, yeah. I mean, the Allies were planning a big spring offensive in 1919, largely based on American troops, of course. So in other words, the war definitely would have lasted longer. I think that's safe to say.
Okay.
And let me also just add here that historians don't 100% agree with each other on this, and it gets political, right? Because one side or the other wants to claim its contribution to the victory is bigger, and so separating those things out becomes very dicey.
Sort of a Treaty of Versailles problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Competing groups.
That's right, exactly. Even though historians, don't want these things, these sort of considerations to intrude, sometimes they do.
Yeah.
And so, for example, if you're a British or French historian, you are more likely to downplay the American contribution and vice versa, right?
I think Americans, even going back to earlier history, early modern history, and even late medieval history, we forget that the French are historically very militaristic. In fact, the European military problem is that you have these two huge militaristic countries, France and Germany, that seem to be fighting all the time.
Sure. Or even before that, France and Britain.
Right. And so to think of the French as sort of genetically weak or genetically cowardly, these things are just not true.
Right.
Literally not true.
No, what were they called once? It was at the time of the Iraq War, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, which, they surrendered in 1940, and they did the right thing because they were getting crushed, right? That's what you do when you're getting crushed, is you surrender.
It saves lives.
They didn't surrender in World War I. War I, they lost 1.3 million dead, which is essentially 10 times what we gave up. The idea that they are like this sort of weak, pusillanimous, unreliable, unmilitarist power is really crazy. In fact, one of the reasons they lose such enormous casualties in World War I is because they're so aggressive.
Right.
On the offensive, they just they sacrifice all sorts of young men because of their militarism, essentially.
And they're not cheese-eating surrender monkeys in the Franco-Prussian War. They're certainly not cheese-eating surrender monkeys in the Napoleonic Wars. Even though they lose, it goes on for a long time.
When they dominated the continent to a greater extent than anyone since Rome, or only rivaled by Hitler later on.
Right.
So,
Okay.
So big picture, it's much more complicated.
So I think it's very clear, and it should be even more clear to the Buzzkillers out there because you've explained it so well. The United States forces may have hastened the end of World War I, or at least made it not drag into 1919, but they didn't bail out the British, didn't bail out the French. What happens in World War II?
Well, one thing I would add is, once again, I've said this on other shows. If you look at the bookshelves in the bookstore, I think it still bears repeating that the United States did not win World War II single-handedly.
That's right. Yeah.
That the Allies bailed out French in World War II. In other words, there was a larger effort to defeat the Germans and the Japanese, in which the United States played an enormous role. Once again, I'm not minimizing that. Absolutely not. But once again, like we talked about the Eastern Front and some of these other things in other shows, 3/4 of the German army is on the Eastern Front fighting against the Soviets.
Right.
And which does make our job, the British job, much easier, not easier on the Western Front. So that's one little thing I would add. It's like it's not just us. But I think even more importantly is that in both World War I and World War II, note that we waited to get involved in both cases.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah.
World War I starts in 1914. We don't join until 1917.
Right.
World War II in Europe starts in 1939. We don't join that war until 1941. So we're not talking months, we're talking years.
Okay, but even joining in 1917 and joining in 1941, our troops don't arrive until much later.
Right, and there's a lag time. Right, exactly. In fact, in Europe, it takes almost a year for us to get engaged against the Germans. The Japanese were engaged a little more quickly against, but on a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
But this is really, really important because we are justly proud of our contributions to both World War I and World War II.
We don't want anyone to think that the Institute is putting out, the message that we shouldn't be proud or that we should be.
Or that we shouldn't acknowledge that.
Right,
we obviously should. But on the other hand, we need to be logically consistent, which is to say that if we praise the United States for joining World Wars I and II, which are both actions that I wholeheartedly support and would have supported.
We should tell the Buzzkillers you're not old enough to have been involved in those decisions.
Yes,
but,
thank you. Well,
but still.
I'm not George Patton, and these are my earlier incarnations.
Yeah.
Counterfactual what I would have done back then. In any case, if we deserve praise for joining those two wars, we also deserve criticism for not joining them earlier.
Okay.
Which is to say, had we joined the war in Europe in 1939 or the war in Europe in 1914, all else being equal, I think those wars would have ended earlier.
Okay.
And we added to the ultimate cost by waiting.
Okay. Now, was there any justification for waiting? Was the U.S. military
absolutely.
not ready?
That's true in both cases. The U.S. military was not ready. That's certainly true. But I mean, not just in terms of our military, but in terms of aid. Like, had we come to the aid of the French and the British massively in 1930, now it's obviously at one level of frivolous counterfactual. Our politics did not allow it in either case.
Right.
There's a strong pro-neutrality strand in
the
both
domestic
cases.
politics.
Yeah, exactly. And we have this 3,000-mile wide moat called the Atlantic, which allows us to stay aloof and not
That's right, yeah.
and not squander our men unnecessarily. Nevertheless, if the claim is we bailed them out, you have to look at that claim and say, like, well, how did we bail them out? Well, in both cases, we waited.
Yeah.
And in the case of World War II, not that we could have prevented the fall of France, not saying that, but we were sitting on the sidelines as France collapsed and then suffered 4 years of Nazi occupation.
Right.
So, yeah, obviously props to us for helping liberate them in 1944. But we didn't move very quickly, and that had an enormous cost. Now, like I said, a lot of Americans didn't want us to get involved, and that's why we didn't. Right, the politics was complicated, and we're a democracy.
Do we know, by the way, if there was any sense that, I'm a little bit idealistic to think there were a bunch of people running around saying, they've been fighting each other since Charlemagne. Why should we get involved? Was there any talk like that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Well,
okay.
Yeah. Well, and keep in mind that in 1917, we break a tradition that was as old as our country itself, which is we had fought against Europeans and other folks, but never in Europe.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
We fought Mexico, we fought Spain, we fought the British twice, but it was always here.
Yeah,
the idea
yeah.
that you send an expeditionary force. And by the way, just parenthetically, when we joined World War I, spring of 1917, it's clear that Wilson didn't at first think we'd have to send troops.
Why?
Because he had no clue about military matters. Yeah, I think he thought we could just sort of like give help and engage in naval action, and that we wouldn't actually have to gear up and send an army over there. He quickly came around to the reality. But but military affairs he had no training, no expertise in military affairs.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think he was just hadn't been well briefed and wasn't thinking about it very hard. But there were a lot of people who said basically stay out of European affairs at all costs, no matter what.
Okay.
Like I said, we like it's later would be called sort of the Fortress America idea. You protect the United States and let Europe go to hell. Now that's fine. We have no dog in that fight.
We can have wars in the Western Hemisphere, but we leave the Eastern Hemisphere alone.
Right, exactly.
Right.
I mean, it's part of the Monroe Doctrine, actually.
Well, that's true. Yeah,
not only that we keep them out of our hemisphere, we stay out of their affairs. So it's a big departure for us, and that's one of the reasons why it's hard for us and takes so long. A lot of people have to come around. But even in World War II, when the threat, i.e. Adolf Hitler, was much more obvious. You still had you had a lot of Americans, for example, feared that we were going to be played by the British.
Played by the British?
Yeah, in other words, the British were trying to manipulate us into the war because they kind of had done that in World War I and certainly tried to. For example, putting golden ammunition on board the Lusitania with civilian hostages up on the deck.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very clever, but there are a lot of Americans who are very, very gun-shy about being manipulated into war. There were people, though, if you look at 1914, there were people like Teddy Roosevelt arguing very strongly that we should join the war immediately. That's not just because he's Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
It's also because there were some good strategic reasons to do that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there were debates in both cases, some of them vicious. But still, like I said, we did not join until a little later in both cases.
So if we want to take a general question of both wars and both interventions, why does the United States join?
Right. And here's my biggest broadside against the Uncle Sucker myth, which is we do it in both cases because we think it's in our interests.
Ah, okay.
In that regard, we are more or less just like every other state that has ever existed in the world. We do things what we think are best for us. We stayed out of World War I for a long time because we thought that was best for us, and then we joined because we thought that was best for us. In that case, we were trying to protect our neutral rights, our trading rights. We had already started to lean toward the British and French by this point in various ways. We wanted also there was a political/moral aspect, right? Make the world safe for democracy, sort of a progressive war. And we were joining them by far the more democratic side.
Right.
So there are a whole bunch of reasons, but those are all reasons that even though Woodrow Wilson's a progressive, he's a pretty cold-blooded realist when it comes to go to war or not. And he felt like we had no choice. It doesn't mean he's right, but that's what he felt like. And it was for American interests. It wasn't an act of charity.
Oh, so we're not a charity.
Right, we're not a charity.
That's what the myth sort of implies.
The myth is that we sort of stay aloof as the bad children mix it up, and then when things go too far, it's almost like this paternal view. Like, in other words, okay, we have to step in and separate the kids. Like,
Right.
like we roll our eyes and say, oh, we have to do this again.
France and Germany are at it again.
Right. And so I guess we have to step in, and that is not at all an accurate picture of our thought process, right? We do a pretty cold-blooded calculation of what's in our interest. Now, we decide, for example, that our interest might include moral issues like spreading democracy or defending democracy.
Yeah, okay,
but still, we do that because Woodrow Wilson is someone who believes that a democratic world
Right.
is one that's better for us.
Oh, okay.
Sure, it's better for them too, but it's better for us. It's
Yeah.
not a sacrificing purely 100% to help out some other people. Not at all.
Okay.
And the same thing in World War II, even more so. People like Franklin Roosevelt, they see two threats to the balances of power that matter a lot to us, the one in East Asia and the one in Europe. Mm-hmm. And German and Japanese militarism were fundamental threats to those balances of power.
Right.
And so we intervened to restore. This is very simple, like political science 101 terms.
Right.
But we intervened to restore that balance of power because German and Japanese power, in our view, were out of hand.
Yeah.
It's not about, oh, those poor French, they need to be saved. You know, we'll be Sir Lancelot.
Right.
I mean, not at all. Like, that is just not how it went down at all. And and in a way, it's a kind of a disservice to our leaders in that period. Like the idea that we just got played.
Yeah.
Like, no, we're doing this for us.
Yeah.
It's a bonus. I mean, it's a nice twofer that liberating France from the Germans also means that millions of French people get to lead decent lives, right? But it's a bonus. That's not the main reason. It's not this, oh, well, we don't want to get involved, but we have to because of all the killing.
Yeah.
That's just not how it went down.
And presumably the same thing is true for the Holocaust going on in the 30s in Germany. That's
Correct.
That's a secondary reason for us, not a primary reason.
Yeah. Oh, no, and that's actually a whole separate point, which is that our involvement in Europe against Hitler has a much better moral appearance in retrospect than it did at the time. Because there wasn't much awareness of the Holocaust at the time, at least not in the American public. There could have been if they were interested. It's not like there was a blackout.
Yeah.
The information was available, but it wasn't in most people's consciousness.
Right.
So I think in retrospect, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, it's a good thing we intervened because it stopped Hitler and stopped the Holocaust." That wasn't the main or even the tertiary motive at the time.
Wow.
Right.
Now, that's interesting because we just recently did a Man Crush Monday show on Varian Fry, and one of the reasons he goes over is to sort of help people get out because he's heard these reports coming back, but the reports are not being distributed in the United States.
That's right.
He hears them in New York, and that's about
right.
it.
And there was stuff in the New York Times about the Holocaust and that sort of thing, but it just wasn't on most people's radar. And generally speaking, the U.S. government goes under a lot of criticism. In my view, a lot of it justified for not doing more about the Holocaust.
Right.
But their argument at the time the argument in the government was, for example, we can't bomb Auschwitz because that detracts from the war effort. The best thing we can do to save people, generally, not just Jews, is to defeat the Germans as quickly as possible.
Right.
That was their argument.
And Professor, one of the things that really always bugged me about this myth when I was teaching was we seem to have forgotten as a country and a culture everything the French as a country and a culture did for us before World War I.
Right, exactly.
And I'm talking way, way back.
Right. This is the other half of the story, which especially these days has gotten lost. And one of the interesting things to me about this is that there was a time when we hadn't forgot these things.
Oh, yeah, most of the 19th century. Yeah.
And what I'm talking about here is what the French did for us, especially in the context of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And once again, just to be clear, I'm not even close to being a Francophile.
Ooh, I am.
I do not speak French. I've spent all of 3 days in Paris. I've not been hired by the French Tourism Promotion Board for this segment.
Oh, wait a minute. There's an advertising opportunity there.
Maybe you should look into that.
Yeah.
But here I'm talking about the French contributions to the American Revolution. If you look at what historians write about this, it's pretty clear there's a consensus that the French were key to the victory of George Washington and the Continental Army and the patriotic cause.
Okay, key. Now that's important.
Key.
Right.
I mean, do I want to say decisive? In other words, do I want to suggest that we wouldn't have won without them? I would not go that far.
The French bailed us out.
Right, exactly. I don't want to go mirror image here, but they're certainly key, and I will draw the equivalence. They were certainly decisive in helping end the war when it ended.
Right. Okay, so that's very similar to...
Right. Yeah, in fact, I'd probably give it more thought, but I think there's a real parallel there. For a long, long time, the French contribution was symbolized in the person of the Marquis de Lafayette.
Okay, now let's remind Buzzkillers who that was.
I'm no expert on Lafayette, but he was a French nobleman. Mm-hmm. He actually came to America and served on Washington's staff.
Yeah.
was an important point person, sort of go-between between the French and the Americans. Later on, he gets into trouble in the French Revolution, as I recall.
That's right. Yeah,
He's I forget all the details, but he's a more complicated figure in France. He's not in America.
No, that's right. Yeah, he's a hero here.
You know, and even it would probably go too far, right? In other words, he's sort of the French presence and the French contribution personified, and of course, it's more complicated than that.
Sure, as it always is, yeah.
But you know, I actually looked it up. I think there's almost 24 place names in the United States. Lafayette.
Yeah, and
towns and cities.
And I think of all these Fayette counties, particularly in places that are sort of post-Revolutionary War in what was then the Western Pennsylvania, and all those sort of downward down the Ohio River states in Ohio. Almost all those states have a Fayette County.
Right.
And if you're in one of those counties, it's because of the Marquis de Lafayette.
And other things, too. I mean, there's a Lafayette College. I mean,
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
I mean, we went through this sort of explosion of naming things after him, and that's not coincidental.
No.
Not at all. And one of the most interesting anecdotes about this is when the American Expeditionary Force arrives in France in spring of 1917. We do send a first sort of token detachment. Our army is not nearly big enough to make a difference, but we do send a token force. I think we send a division at first.
And that's not the AEF.
It is the AEF. Right. Yeah, it's sort of the spearhead, or the vanguard, I should say. The vanguard of the AEF arrives. John J. Blackjack Pershing, the American general commander of the AEF, he arrives. I had always understood that he essentially gets off the boat and says, Lafayette, we are here.
Yeah, and I always thought that. In fact, I think I told my students that.
Yeah, I'm sure I did too. That's the bumper sticker version.
Yeah.
Turns out that he didn't actually say that, and he didn't say that, and nobody said that as they got off the boat.
Right.
There was a little bit of a lag, and it turns out, if you look into this, there was an event, a sort of a wreath-laying ceremony at the tomb of Lafayette in France on America's Independence Day, July 4th, 1917.
Oh, okay.
And it was not Pershing himself, but one of his aides, I think a lieutenant colonel, by the name of Charles Stanton. He made the remarks, and I'm going to actually quote from some of it, not the whole thing, because it is kind of interesting in this context. And I'm quoting, "I regret I cannot speak to the good people of France in the beautiful language of their fair country. The fact cannot be forgotten that your nation was our friend when America was struggling for existence, when a handful of brave and patriotic people were determined to uphold the rights their Creator gave them, that France, in the person of Lafayette, came to our aid in words and deed. It would be ingratitude not to remember this, and America defaults no obligations." Then he continues, "America has joined forces with the Allied powers, and what we have of blood and treasure are yours. Therefore it is with loving pride we drape the colors in tribute of respect to this citizen of your great republic, and here and now in the shadow of the illustrious dead we pledge our hearts and our honor in carrying this war to successful issue. Lafayette, we are here."
Ah, so like a lot of quotes, it's been said by somebody else, but then applied to a bigger
right. And in case there's any doubt about this, the source for the idea that this was not Pershing, but it was Stanton, the source is Pershing himself. In his memoir, he says, "I get credit for this. I don't deserve it. It was Charles Stanton who said it." But the idea that that's how you would sort of cap, now obviously it's at Lafayette's tomb, so he's obviously the center of attention. But still, the idea that in any context, that's how you would frame the arrival of the American forces as sort of repaying a debt, that I think would surprise a lot of people today, considering all the things that have happened in the interim.
Oh, yeah, and considering this myth. In other words, in 1917, Pershing's underlings, at least, didn't think the way these myth mongers do now.
You know, and there are many different ways. I mean, if you look at that quote I just gave you, you could argue it's a little over the top. I mean, it could have been a lot more dutiful. It could have been a lot more minimal. He didn't have to go as far. For example, I mean, he even says, like, I'm sorry I couldn't say this in French.
Yeah, well,
can you imagine anyone saying that today? Certainly one of our military commanders?
No.
I mean, that would be a bit of a stretch. Maybe somebody would. But in any case, let's look into the actual history, just so people are clear what the French contribution is.
Why, in fact, Stanton thinks to say that.
Right. And once again, the reverse is not true either. In other words, this is not France acting as a charity. This is not France saying, "Oh, those poor Americans, let's help them out."
You mean in a revolutionary time?
Yeah, I'm sorry, in the revolutionary period. This is the French acting in what they think is their own interest. And let's keep in mind that in 1763, that they had not only been defeated, but humiliated in North America by the British at the end of the French and Indian War / 7 Years' War. One war, two titles.
Yeah. Sort of like the Civil War, the different battles have different names.
Yes. And so this is Louis XVI's France, and they have been, at one level, looking for payback.
Yeah,
against the British. Yes,
right,
they are hungry for revenge and looking for opportunities. That was true ever since 1763. They're also just flat out looking in terms of strategic calculation. That if you aid this American war for independence, you can greatly complicate British strategy. And you've basically multiplied Britain's strategic problems. By the way, I don't know if they went through this, but even from a cynical standpoint, even if you just keep the American Revolution alive as opposed to it prevailing, in other words, like sort of turn America into Britain's Vietnam, to talk out of chronological order, right? In other words, make it like the sort of costly sort of quagmire for them. Right. That's all good for France. Maybe you can do that at a minimal cost to yourselves.
It's also good for French trade. I mean, French trade can continue uninhibited, so to speak, whereas British trade is bogged down by the war.
And of course, and they're taking the French in this context are taking advantage of the fact that the British, as of 1775, 76, are becoming spread a little thin.
Yeah,
they have a massive global empire. Their navy is big and powerful, but it can't do everything. They're becoming increasingly isolated. So the French figure, well, why not? And so at first they start to give covert aid.
Right.
To the Americans. Weapons, financial aid, supplies, stuff like that.
Well, what goes around comes around.
Pretty much. And, if people know their history of the American Revolution, the period 1776-77, it's not going very well for George Washington. He almost loses the war on Brooklyn in 1776.
Kind of need somebody to bail him out.
Yeah, they do. And they are kept alive. His army is kept alive in part because of French aid.
Okay.
During this period, keep in mind there's a global context. French ports throughout this period are open to the American Navy and American privateers, which helps their operations a great deal against the British. And there are Americans working very, very hard to get the French to join the war.
Now, are these American diplomats in
Europe,
Paris?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
People like Silas Deane, they're in other words, we're not just sitting back and saying, "Boy, I hope the French would get involved." No, we are working them hard.
Right.
It's like because we're desperate.
Oh, sure.
And they know we're desperate.
Sure.
Also, often overlooked, the French in this period and well into the 1780s are fighting against the British worldwide.
Yes, that's right.
In the West Indies, in India, all around the globe, and those operations often don't go very well for the French.
No, that's right.
Especially in India. So they're engaged with the British all around the world, not just in North America.
So trying to keep the British tied down as much in America as possible is only good for their French effort in India, et cetera, et cetera,
yeah,
et cetera.
It's all part of this bigger picture where, even if you suffer a defeat here, you might suffer a victory here, and hope just essentially play whack-a-mole.
Yeah,
and make it so the British are tied down everywhere. And this helps the French. The Royal Navy gets spread very, very thin and can't do everything it could once do because it has so many commitments around the world. The British strategic problem. So fast forward to 1781, a French fleet under Comte de Grasse defeats the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake.
Right.
This is September 1781. And by the way, we always hear about Trafalgar and how the British are constantly schooling their enemies on the high seas.
Oh, yeah.
Not always. Not in this case. And these forces were pretty evenly matched, and the British, they weren't crushed.
No.
But they were trying to make it so the French fleet goes away, and they failed. And what that means is that the British army concentrating at Yorktown, Virginia at the same time can be neither evacuated nor reinforced. Because the French fleet basically seals off Chesapeake Bay.
Okay.
And so that British army is now pinned on land, and then on land it is pinned by Washington's army, so this is the famous Battle of Yorktown, October 1781. The American army lays siege to the British army, and by American army, I mean the Franco-American army.
Oh, now this is something I'm sure almost no one knows about or no one thinks about very much.
If you look at the troop totals, not quite half, but at least 40% of Washington's forces are in fact French troops.
Holy cow.
Thousands of them. So it's not just Lafayette hanging out in Washington's headquarters.
Right,
It's not fully, almost half of Washington's force. It depends on whether you count the American militia. But it's almost half of the American force that successfully wins the Battle of Yorktown is in fact French troops. Under Rochambeau.
Okay.
So White Cornwallis is crushed. He has to surrender his army. The war doesn't end until 1783. There's a lag.
Yeah, but
the Yorktown victory was decisive. That's what led the British to say, you know what, we have to wash our hands of this American adventure and come to terms.
So this seems almost, well, in many ways parallel to the 1917-18 experience on the other way around. But it seems almost as if the French are more crucial to the American victory at Yorktown anyway than the British are to the French victory.
I would let's put it this way: at least as important. Yeah, I think that's safe to say.
So we don't get firebombed by certain talk radio people. We need to be careful what we say.
Yeah. But also keep in mind that it's not just this sort of detached, write another check for the Americans.
Yeah.
They're sending troops. French troops are fighting and dying, right? French troops, not in large numbers. By the way, the scale of the Revolutionary War is just tiny compared to future wars.
Oh, sure.
Washington's army total is like 16,000, 17,000 men, which is, in World War II, that's going to be like a division and a regiment.
Yeah,
I mean, it's amazing the scale.
Yeah.
But still, the French, there are some French paying the ultimate sacrifice. And the great irony to me
Speaking
here,
of paying,
the financial cost for the French is huge.
Yeah.
They spend, the figure I saw is 1.3 billion livres. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation because French not my strong suit, just like Charles Stanton's. But that's livres are essentially pounds.
Right.
So this is is over $1 billion with a B. That is a major financial commitment.
In the 1780s.
In the 1780s. And it's so major that it helps bankrupt the French monarchy and actually contributes to the French Revolution of 1789.
So the French crown, the French monarchy ends up sort of sacrificing itself for the American Revolution.
Yeah. In effect.
Wow.
Obviously, that was not the plan.
No.
But let's just say they were free spending in a lot of ways. And they were like borrowing a lot of money. It was the French finances up until the 1789 Revolution are a mess.
Yeah.
But part of that mess is this huge cost of supporting the American victory. In other words, you could almost argue that they became overly obsessed with sticking to the British. And then later on, I had a lot of regrets about it.
Or at least the French crown did.
It's like, I mean, what's going through Louis XVI's head when he's like entering the guillotine? It's like, damn, I wish I hadn't spent all that money on the Americans.
I might still have a crown I can cherish.
Exactly.
So, Professor, we have bankrupted the French crown. We've contributed to
Our work here is done.
We've contributed to the French Revolution in 1789. The French have greatly contributed to the American Revolution and its success in the 1770s, 1780s. Does this just then get forgotten? What happens in the then 18th century, 19th century, 20th century?
Yeah, I mean,
American,
obviously historical memory is an issue in all countries, including our own.
Yeah.
And, humans are flawed. Humans are self-serving. Humans are selfish. We love to pat ourselves on the back. We grudgingly give credit to other people. And so I think over time we lost this sense of Lafayette, we are here. A lot of Americans probably don't know who Lafayette is.
No,
I think a lot of Americans would be surprised to find out the role that the French played in the American Revolution. They wouldn't be surprised to find out the role we played in World War I and World War II. Certainly World War II. Those stories are well known. So obviously France owes us a lot for helping them into world wars.
Sure.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but there is no comparison between French life under Nazi occupation and France after 1945. They're just, right? I mean, just so we're clear. I mean, even though I don't want to get in the weeds, but the German occupation of France is not nearly as brutal as, say, the German occupation of Poland.
Right.
Or of the Soviet Union. Right. Nevertheless,
it's partly because the French, they surrender right away. It's almost as if Paris is an open city. Right. Just come in. We don't want to.
That is that. But also the Germans think more highly of the French and treat them better. Now, they also enslave millions of French people.
Sure.
By the way, one of the reasons you had such a big French resistance movement is they were people who were about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into working in German factories.
Okay.
Once again, boneheaded Nazi occupation policy, their own worst enemy.
Yeah.
So the French owe us a lot for helping them in 2 world wars. We owe them a lot for our very creation.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a country. I think that's a good way to put it. And so basically, personally anyway, I look forward to the French beer commercial.
a commercial commercial in France.
The French do drink beer. It's not just red wine, by the way.
Not just Germans.
And they have some good beers. But I'm looking forward to the French beer commercial. It's hard to respect the Americans when you have to bail them out when they rebel against the British. But we have to hand it to them on milkshakes.
Oh, that's right.
Nice job, Joey.
We invented milkshakes.
And by the way, the list of things we invented it on. I looked this up too. It's long. I could have put in fried chicken or a bunch of other things, but
Yeah, and they have McDonald's in Paris and
they do.
all across
I
France.
talk about this with my students where they serve the McCamembert, by the way, and I'm not making that up. It's on baguette. It has camembert because if you're going to get French people into McDonald's, that's what you have to do.
Oh, yes. And I remember the first time I went to France, probably in 79 or 80, was shocked to find that you could buy beer and wine in McDonald's.
I know. It's thoroughly civilized. But let me just end on this last note. You said you will put this up on the website, so folks will be able to look at this.
This is an image we're talking about.
It's an image. This is a postage stamp from 1931, so marking the, the sesquicentennial, 150th?
I always forget what that is.
I think it's the 150th anniversary of Yorktown. And it basically has Washington in the center, not surprisingly, but he's flanked by two French people. One is Rochambeau and one is de Grasse.
Yeah.
That was the land and naval leaders
I see. Okay.
of the French effort to help us at Yorktown.
See, that's very specific because it's not Lafayette. It's really talking about the people who were involved.
Exactly, and acknowledging that it's not Lafayette who helped us win the Battle of Yorktown as much as these two gentlemen, and they are given equal billing on this stamp. Now, of course, they're both looking toward Washington, I guess, graphically.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the whole idea that then on one of our stamps we would so openly acknowledge the debt, I'm thinking we probably wouldn't put on a stamp today.
No. I mean, they're on an equal level. The image of Washington is not larger than the other two images.
Right.
It's really impressive.
I wish I would be able to live long enough to get to the year 2081 to see how we mark Yorktown on our stamps if we do that.
Yeah.
But I thought it was pretty interesting as a little bit of pop culture.
Well, it also is interesting and fascinating that in 1931 you could send a letter for 2 cents.
That too.
But, the Buzzkillers will have to go on any of our social media to see that image. Well, thank you so much, Professor. The French, I mean, we may not owe the gratitude to the French that we should owe them, but I certainly owe the gratitude to you that I should owe
thanks.
you. And the Buzzkillers are great, are very, very grateful, I'm sure, to have you back on the show.
Merci.
So thanks for this. And Buzzkillers out there, we'll talk to you next week.